My sister tore my vows and smashed our gifts, shouting I was arrogant. Mom hugged her. I stayed silent. That night, I canceled her car lease and cut her allowance. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones when you spend your entire life being the responsible one. It does not happen overnight. It is a slow, creeping weight, built dollar by dollar, compromise by compromise, until one day you wake up and realize you are not a son or a brother anymore. You are an ATM. You are an insurance policy. My name is Carter. I am 32 years old, and for the last decade, I have been the financial and emotional safety net for a family that never truly respected me. To understand what happened on my wedding day, you have to understand the dynamic I grew up in. I did not inherit success. I crawled through my 20s on my hands and knees. I am talking about working grueling consulting gigs, taking red-eye flights, sleeping on airport benches because I could not afford a hotel room before a morning meeting, and eating cheap ramen just to make rent. I sacrificed my youth to build a stable life. And right by my side for the hardest parts of it was Julia. Julia is 30 now, and she has been my rock, my absolute peace in a world full of noise. We built our life together, brick by brick. But then there is my sister, Cassidy. Cassidy is 22. 10 years younger than me, and raised in a completely different reality. If I was the family workhorse, Cassidy was the golden child. Our parents, Gregory and Diana, treated her like she was made of spun glass. Every mistake she made was brushed off as a learning experience. Every failure was someone else's fault. And as my career took off and I started making real money, my parents silently shifted the burden of her lifestyle onto my shoulders. It started small, covering an overdraft fee here, paying for a textbook there. But the entitlement grew like a weed. Let me tell you about the Miami incident 2 years ago. Cassidy was 20. She and her friends rented a luxury waterfront property for spring break. Predictably, they threw a massive party, completely trashed the place, and broke several high-end pieces of furniture. The owner was threatening to call the police and press charges for property damage. Who did my parents call at 2 in the morning? Me. I had to wire $3,000 on the spot to keep my little sister out of a Florida jail cell. Did my parents punish her? No. My mother, Diana, literally cried on the phone, telling me how proud she was that I stepped up to protect the family. She told me I was a good big brother. There were no consequences for Cassidy. She didn't have to get a summer job to pay me back. She didn't even apologize. She just went back to her sorority life, completely unbothered, while I worked overtime to recover the $3,000 I had just set on fire. That was the moment I realized my parents did not see me as a person. They saw me as a resource. And Cassidy? She just saw me as an endless well of cash that she had a birthright to tap into. The resentment really began to boil over this past April. I remember the phone call perfectly because I was in the middle of a major project presentation. Cassidy called me 6 times in a row. I stepped out, heart pounding, thinking someone was in the hospital. I answered the phone, and she was crying hysterically. She told me her car was breaking down. She said the engine was making terrifying noises, the brakes were failing, and she felt unsafe driving to her college classes. She needed $1,200 for emergency repairs, and she needed it that exact day. I transferred the money immediately. I did not even question it. Despite everything, she was my little sister, and I did not want her driving a dangerous vehicle. 2 days later, I was scrolling through social media. One of her friends had tagged her in a video. There was Cassidy, wearing glitter on her face, dancing at a massive, 3-day VIP music festival in the desert. The tickets for that specific VIP tier cost exactly $1,200. She did not fix her car. She scammed me to go party. When I confronted my parents about it, my father, Gregory, sighed loudly into the receiver and told me, "Carter, she is young. She just wanted to have fun with her friends. You make good money, do not be so stingy. Let it go." I let it go. But something inside me snapped permanently. I stopped answering her casual texts. I stopped transferring small amounts of money. Then came the incident 3 weeks before my wedding. Cassidy called me, sounding incredibly annoyed. She did not ask, she informed me that her car was officially dead and she needed a brand new lease. She already picked out the model. A luxury compact SUV. She wanted me to go to the dealership, co-sign the lease, and set up the automatic monthly payments from my account. I sat at my kitchen table, looked at Julia, and for the first time in my life, I gave Cassidy a single, hard word: no. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. She asked me what I meant. I told her I was tired of being her backup plan, tired of being lied to, and that I was about to get married and needed to focus on my own financial future. She did not argue. She did not scream. She just breathed heavily into the microphone and hung up without saying goodbye. I assumed she would just sulk and complain to our parents. I assumed wrong. I had no idea that my simple refusal was the spark that would ignite the most unhinged revenge plot I have ever witnessed. August 3rd. The day I had been looking forward to for 2 years. It was supposed to be the happiest, most peaceful day of my life. Julia and I did not want a massive, chaotic event. We booked an intimate, vintage venue with exposed brick walls and dim, romantic lighting. We kept the guest list strictly to 43 people, only our closest friends and immediate family. There was soft jazz playing in the background. The air smelled like fresh eucalyptus and roasted coffee. When I saw Julia walk down the aisle, everything else melted away. She looked like a dream. She wore a simple, elegant white gown, and the way she smiled at me made all those years of sleeping on airport benches feel completely worth it. I finally made something of myself, and I finally had the love of my life standing right in front of me. I thought, for once, I was allowed to celebrate my own happiness. But there was a black cloud in the room. Cassidy. She showed up late, missing the entire ceremony. That should have been my first red flag. When she finally walked into the reception area, she was wearing a bright gold, deeply backless dress that looked like it belonged at a Vegas nightclub, not an intimate afternoon wedding. She did not come over to say hello. She did not congratulate Julia. She walked straight to the bar, grabbed a glass of red wine, and found a corner near the back of the room. Every time I glanced in her direction, she was staring at me. It was not a normal look. It was a cold, piercing glare, like I was a stranger who had deeply offended her. To anyone else, it might have looked like she was just being a moody 22-year-old who hated weddings. But I knew my sister. I knew that specific posture. That silence was not boredom, it was the prelude to an explosion. She was vibrating with anger. I tried to ignore her. I held Julia's hand. I greeted our friends. I ate the amazing food we had catered. But you can only ignore a ticking bomb for so long. She waited for the perfect moment. She waited until I was completely exposed. She waited until the toasts. I tapped my glass with a spoon. The room grew quiet. I stood up, smiling, pulling a folded piece of thick parchment paper from my inside jacket pocket. These were the vows Julia and I had written together, the promises we were making to each other for the rest of our lives. I cleared my throat, looking around the room, feeling overwhelmed with gratitude. I started speaking about love, about patience, and about building a sanctuary with someone who brings you absolute peace. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flash of gold. Cassidy stood up. For a split second, my brain tried to rationalize what was happening. I thought maybe my parents had put her up to giving a surprise speech. I thought maybe she was going to publicly apologize for being distant. But she did not walk toward the microphone. She marched directly toward the sweetheart table where Julia and I were sitting. Her face was twisted into an ugly, unrecognizable sneer. Before I could even process the threat, she reached across the table and snatched the parchment paper right out of my hands. My handwritten vows. The words I was just about to read to my wife. She grabbed the thick paper and viciously tore it right down the middle, ripping it into shreds and throwing the pieces onto the floor. A collective gasp sucked all the air out of the room. Julia recoiled in shock. I froze. But Cassidy was not done. She spun around, facing the small, beautifully decorated table holding our wedding gifts and a framed photograph of Julia and me from our first vacation together. Cassidy raised her full glass of red wine and hurled it like a baseball. The glass hit the table, exploding into shards. Dark red wine splattered across the white tablecloth and dripped down the wall. The heavy glass frame holding our photo crashed to the hardwood floor, the glass shattering into 100 pieces. People started backing away. Someone dropped a fork. Then, she turned to the dessert table. We had a beautiful, custom 3-tier wedding cake decorated with delicate sugar flowers. Cassidy stepped up to it, placed both of her hands on the edge of the wooden cake stand, and shoved it with all her body weight. The stand tipped. The entire cake collapsed onto the floor in a massive, ugly pile of white frosting and crushed sponge. She stood amidst the wreckage of my wedding day, her chest heaving, her gold dress stained with a few drops of wine. She looked me dead in the eye, pointed a trembling finger at me, and screamed at the top of her lungs, loud enough to echo off the brick walls. "This is what you get for acting like you are better than everyone else. You arrogant, selfish prick." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The jazz music had been killed by the DJ. No one moved. No one breathed. You could hear the faint dripping of red wine hitting the floorboards. 43 pairs of eyes darted between me, Julia, and my raging sister. If this were a movie, this would be the moment I stood up and screamed back. This would be the moment I kicked her out, cursed her name, and demanded justice. But this was real life, and I was looking at a person who fed on drama. I realized in that split second that any reaction from me, anger, tears, shouting, would only feed her. It would validate her tantrum. So, I did the only thing that would completely destroy her momentum. I did absolutely nothing. I remained perfectly, terrifyingly still. My mother, Diana, finally broke the spell. Did she yell at her daughter? Did she apologize to my crying wife? No. She rushed across the room, navigating around the smashed cake, and wrapped her arms around Cassidy. She pulled her into a tight embrace, stroking her hair like Cassidy was a victim of a tragic accident. It is okay, my mother whispered loudly enough for the front row to hear. She is just overwhelmed. She just needs to let it out. She just needs to let it out. Those words hit me harder than the shattered glass. She destroyed my wedding, terrified my wife, and humiliated me in front of my closest friends, and my mother was comforting her. Cassidy pulled away from my mother's hug. She did not shed a single tear. Her eyes were dry and full of defiance. She turned on her heel and walked out of the venue doors, her heels clicking loudly on the pavement outside. She looked triumphant. Like she had finally put me in my place. I slowly sat back down. Julia reached over and grabbed my hand. Her fingers were shaking. I squeezed her hand gently, kissed her knuckles, and nodded to the wedding coordinator to start cleaning up. The rest of the night limped along like a wounded animal. The caterers awkwardly swept up the cake. The DJ put the music back on at a low volume. A few brave friends came up to awkwardly pat my shoulder, trying to pretend the last 10 minutes had not happened. We cut a backup sheet cake from the kitchen. We had our first dance, but the magic was dead. The memory of our beautiful day was already stamped with a permanent, ugly stain. I smiled, I thanked everyone for coming, and I played the perfect host. But behind my smile, my mind was racing with a cold, terrifying clarity. We left the venue just before midnight. The ride back to our apartment was silent. The city lights flickered across the windshield, but I wasn't seeing them. I was seeing spreadsheets. I was seeing bank accounts. I was seeing every single dollar I had bled for that family over the last 10 years. When we walked into our apartment, Julia carefully unzipped her dress. She sat on the edge of the bed, looking exhausted. She looked up at me and asked softly, "Are you okay?" I looked at her, and for the first time all day, I smiled a genuine smile. "I am fine," I said. And I meant it. Because the burden of obligation had just been lifted. While Julia went to take a shower, I did not pour a drink. I did not sit and cry. I walked out to the living room, sat down at my desk, and opened my laptop. I cracked my knuckles. It was time for a midnight audit. First, I logged into the university's financial portal. Because my parents refused to help, I was the one who had submitted the massive tuition deposit for Cassidy's upcoming fall semester. $9,400. I navigated to the payment history, clicked on the active deposit, and hit Request Full Refund. A warning popped up stating that withdrawing the funds would unenroll the student from all registered classes. I did not even blink. I clicked Confirm. $9,400, routing back to my savings account in 3 to 5 business days. Next, I opened a new tab. The auto dealership portal. Remember that luxury SUV lease she demanded? I didn't get her a new one, but I was still the sole financier on the car she currently drove. The car was legally mine, she was just an authorized driver. I went into the billing section and canceled the automatic monthly payments. Then I navigated to the insurance portal. I removed her name as an authorized driver and suspended the collision coverage on that specific vehicle. Finally, I sent an automated email through the portal to the local dealership, informing them that the vehicle would no longer be funded and requesting instructions for a voluntary repossession process. Last but not least, I logged into my primary bank account. I found the supplementary credit card I had issued in her name 2 years ago for emergencies. The one she used for the music festival. I clicked Report Card Lost/Stolen and then selected Permanently Close Account. I sat back in my chair and watched the screen dim. Within 15 minutes, I had dismantled her entire adult life. The safety net was gone. The Bank of Carter was permanently closed. I closed the laptop, walked into the bedroom, and slept better than I had in 10 years. If you find this story interesting and amusing, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the name of the city you live in. Every comment helps the video reach a wider audience. Thank you so much. The next morning was the quietest I had experienced in years. I woke up at 7 in our apartment, the sun filtering through the blinds, casting long, peaceful stripes across the floor. Julia was still asleep, her breathing steady. I didn't feel the usual knot of anxiety in my stomach, the one that usually came with checking my phone to see what fire I needed to put out for Cassidy. I went to the kitchen, ground some fresh beans, and started a pour-over. I wanted to taste every drop of that coffee. I knew the storm was coming. I had timed everything the night before. By 8 in the morning, the university financial office would have processed the withdrawal, and the car dealership system would have flagged the insurance cancellation and the payment suspension. I sat at the small breakfast bar, watching the clock on the stove. 8:15. 8:30. At exactly 8:40 in the morning, my phone, which was sitting face down on the granite counter, began to vibrate. The screen lit up with Cassidy's name. I didn't pick it up. I didn't even feel the urge to. I just watched it dance across the counter until it went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it started again. Another missed call. Then the text started flooding in, the digital version of a person drowning. The first one was short. What the hell? Why is the student portal locked? The second one came 30 seconds later. I can't access my accounts. Did you do something? My card just declined at the coffee shop. Fix this now. I could almost hear her voice, the high-pitched, entitled whine she used whenever reality didn't bend to her will. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I thought about the torn parchment paper on the floor of the wedding venue. I thought about the red wine dripping off the framed photo of me and Julia. By 9 in the morning, I had 6 missed calls and 12 text messages. The tone had shifted from confusion to pure, unadulterated rage. She wasn't asking what happened anymore. She was demanding I stop being a child and reinstate her life. I didn't reply because I knew that any word I sent would be used as fuel. I wasn't hiding, I was simply finished. Julia walked into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. She looked at the vibrating phone and then at me. I handed her a mug. She's figured it out, I said quietly. Julia looked at the screen, saw the wall of text, and then looked back at me. Are you going to answer? No, I replied. I reached over, picked up the phone, and flipped the switch on the side to mute it. I want to enjoy the silence for once. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't Cassidy's safety net. I wasn't the one responsible for her bills, her mistakes, or her education. The real news had hit her bank account, and for the first time, she was standing on her own 2 feet, only to realize she had never learned how to balance. It was the most expensive silence I had ever purchased, and it was worth every penny of that $9,400 refund. Silence on a phone is one thing, physical presence is another. 2 days after the wedding, Cassidy showed up at our apartment. She didn't call ahead. She didn't text to see if we were home. She just started banging on the door at 6 in the evening. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a loud, rhythmic pounding, the kind a toddler does when they want a toy. Julia was in the hallway, and she looked through the peephole. She turned back to me and mouthed, "It's her." "Don't open it," I whispered. But Cassidy wouldn't stop. She started shouting through the wood, her voice carrying through the entire hallway of our building. "Carter, I know you're in there. You can't just do this. You have a moral obligation to finish what you started." Julia, who has a much lower tolerance for public embarrassment than I do, finally cracked the door open a few inches. She didn't let Cassidy in. She just stood in the gap. "What do you want, Cassidy?" Julia asked, her voice cold and professional. Cassidy didn't even acknowledge Julia as a person. She tried to push past her, but Julia didn't budge. "I need to talk to my brother," Cassidy snapped. "He pulled my tuition. My car is being repossessed in 3 days because the insurance was canceled and the payments stopped. I have 5 days to pay my rent, and I already spent my summer job money on things. He has no right to yank everything without warning." I was standing in the living room, perfectly visible if she just craned her neck, but I didn't move. I listened to her list of demands. It was fascinating, really. Not once did she mention the wedding. Not once did she say, "I'm sorry I destroyed the most important day of your life." To her, the destruction of my wedding was a non-event, but the destruction of her right to my money was a human rights violation. "He's not interested in talking to you," Julia said firmly. "Tell him he's being a narcissistic prick." Cassidy screamed. "He can't legally do this." I checked. I'm a resident in that apartment. Actually, I had checked the lease too. I was the primary on the account. She was just the resident. As the primary, I had every right to withdraw my financial backing. The same went for the car. I had been the one to sign the papers. I was the one who owned the debt. If I chose to stop paying, that was between me and the bank. Cassidy continued to shout about her legal rights and how I was ruining her future for another 10 minutes. She told Julia that I was letting my success go to my head and that I was punishing her for being overwhelmed. When she realized we weren't going to let her in, she kicked the bottom of the door and stormed off, shouting that she would see me in court. I almost laughed. With what money was she going to hire a lawyer? The escalation happened 3 days later. Cassidy had spent 72 hours sending me emails with detailed breakdowns of her expenses, trying to guilt me into reinstating the tuition deposit. I had ignored every single one. I think the realization was finally setting in that I wasn't going to fold this time. And when Cassidy gets desperate, she gets dangerous. Julia was coming home from work. I was already in the kitchen starting dinner. I heard the front door of the building buzz, and then a few minutes later, I heard a scuffle in the hallway. Apparently, Cassidy had been lurking in the stairwell, waiting for Julia to arrive. As Julia was unlocking our apartment door, Cassidy tried to physically shove her way in behind her. She thought if she could just get inside the 4 walls of our home, she could force a confrontation. She picked the wrong person to ambush. Julia didn't scream. She didn't panic. She has spent 10 years watching me deal with this family, and she had reached her absolute limit. I walked toward the door just in time to see the end of it. Julia had dropped her work bag. She didn't use words. She reached out, grabbed a handful of Cassidy's hair near the scalp, and used her other hand to grip Cassidy's shoulder. With one fluid, powerful motion, she pivoted and shoved Cassidy back out into the hallway. Cassidy stumbled, shrieking in shock, her heels skidding on the carpeted floor. She looked up from the floor, her eyes wide, probably expecting a shouting match. But Julia didn't give her one. Julia just stood in the doorway, her face like stone. "If you ever touch this door again," Julia said, her voice low and dangerous, "I won't call your mother." I will call the police, and I will make sure the report includes the fact that you tried to force your way into a private residence. Get out of this building, Cassidy. Now. Julia stepped back, shut the door, and turned the deadbolt. The click of the lock sounded like a gavel hitting a block. She leaned her back against the door for a second, took a deep breath, and then looked at me. I'm done being nice, she said. I think you made that clear, I replied, feeling a surge of pride and relief. 10 minutes later, my phone lit up again. It wasn't Cassidy this time. It was my father, Gregory. He started the call with a heavy, performative sigh, the one he used when he wanted me to know I was being difficult. Carter, we need to talk about your sister, he said. She just called us, hysterical. She says Julia attacked her? She's spiraling, son. You need to help her land. What happened at the wedding, it was just emotions. You're old enough now to be the bigger person. Don't punish her for a bad moment. It wasn't a moment, Dad, I said, my voice steady. It was a pattern. And Julia didn't attack her. She defended our home. Cassidy tried to break in. Family unity, Carter, he started to drone on. We have to stay together. I hung up. I didn't want to hear about family unity from a man who had watched his daughter tear up my marriage vows and didn't say a word. I sat down on the couch with Julia, poured 2 glasses of wine, and we sat in the quiet. The weight was still there, but for the first time, it didn't feel like it was mine to carry alone. We didn't talk about Cassidy for the rest of the night. We talked about us. We talked about the life we were actually going to live now that the circus had finally left town. The next phase of the fallout moved to the digital realm. Cassidy realized that physical intimidation wouldn't work, so she pivoted to the only other weapon she knew, public shaming. It started with a family group chat. My father added me, Julia, my mother Diana, and Cassidy into one chaotic vortex on a Wednesday afternoon. The first message was from him. Let's have an honest talk without yelling or blocking. We are still a family. Cassidy chimed in immediately. She had clearly spent some time crafting her message. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation. She wrote about how hurt she was, how she had acted out at the wedding because she felt invisible and forgotten. She claimed I had been rubbing my success in her face for years and that my financial support was actually a form of control. Then my mother, Diana, joined the fray. It's time to move forward, Carter, she wrote. Forgive her while she is still finding herself. She is still your baby sister. I watched the typing bubbles appear and disappear for a long time. Julia looked over my shoulder, read the messages, and silently left the group chat. She didn't even say goodbye. She just opted out of the insanity. I stayed just long enough to say what needed to be said. I typed out exactly 3 sentences, ensuring there was no room for misinterpretation. She is not a baby. She is 22 years old, and she needs to learn the cost of disrespect. Do not add me to this chat again. I left the group. The silence that followed was that weird, digital tension that feels louder than actual shouting. I knew they were all sitting in their respective houses, staring at the notification that Carter has left the conversation, and for the first time, they realized they couldn't just talk me back into being their bank account. 2 days later, I heard through my cousin Haley that Cassidy had officially packed up and left her apartment. She couldn't pay the rent, she couldn't find a subletter, and without a car, she couldn't even get to her part-time job. The management company contacted me for the final paperwork because I was the co-signer. I didn't fight it. I signed the documents to terminate the lease, paid the small exit fee to protect my own credit score, and officially severed the last legal tie I had to her living situation. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A week later, Haley sent me a link to an Instagram reel. You need to see this, she texted. She's gone full theater kid. I clicked the link. It was a teaser trailer for a new podcast. The title appeared in bold, trendy lettering across a black and white photo of a lonely-looking swing set, bloodline bruises, growing up with the golden child. I hit play. Cassidy's voice came through the speakers, filtered and dramatic, backed by somber, cinematic music. I thought family meant safety, she whispered into the microphone. I thought having a successful older brother meant I had a mentor. But sometimes, The most toxic people in your life are the ones you share a last name with. She went on to describe a harrowing experience where she was financially abused and physically assaulted for simply trying to express her emotions at a family event. She didn't name me or Julia, but she didn't have to. Anyone who knew us knew exactly who she was talking about. The kicker came at the very end of the video. This episode is brought to you by our sponsor, she said, naming a popular therapy app. I stared at the screen. That was the exact therapy app one had introduced her to a year ago. I was the one who had set up her account and paid for her first 6 months of sessions when she called me crying from a bar bathroom about a panic attack. And now she was using that same connection to monetize her trauma at my expense. The video had over 10,000 views in 24 hours. The comments were a cesspool of strangers calling her brave and inspiring. They were telling her how much they related to having an arrogant, successful sibling who tried to buy their love and then snatched it away. It was surreal. I was being written into someone else's fiction. In her world, I wasn't the guy who worked 80 hours a week to pay her rent. I was the villain who used money as a leash. I felt a weird sense of detachment. It was so theatrical, so scripted, that it didn't even feel like it was about me anymore. Then I received an email from her. The subject line was simply, "Let's talk." The body of the email was terrifyingly composed. "I'd like to meet," she wrote. "No drama, just a conversation. I have things I want to tell you. I think you'll be proud of me." It didn't sound like Cassidy. It sounded like someone had written it for her, probably a PR script from her new podcast career. Julia read it twice and looked at me. "She's not trying to fix anything," Julia said. "She's setting a trap. She probably wants to record the conversation for her next episode." "I know," I said. I replied with one single line, "Julia will be there, too." She never wrote back. But I knew the final confrontation wasn't going to happen over email. It was going to happen at my front door. 3 days later, the doorbell rang at 7:15 in the evening. Julia and I were halfway through dinner. We didn't even have to look at each other to know who it was. I opened the door halfway. My parents were standing there. My father, Gregory, gave a little, awkward wave like he was just stopping by to borrow a cup of sugar. My mother, Diana, had her purse slung over her shoulder like she was planning on staying for the weekend. "We just want to talk calmly, Carter," my mother said. "You have 3 minutes," I told them. They walked in anyway. Julia stayed in the kitchen, her arms crossed, her face a mask of absolute indifference. She wasn't going to do the polite host thing anymore, and I loved her for it. My mother started immediately. She told me that Cassidy was going through a transformative period and that she regretted her mistakes deeply. She claimed the podcast was just Cassidy's way of processing her trauma and that I shouldn't take it so personally. Then my dad dropped the bombshell. "She moved back in with us temporarily," he said. "Just until she figures things out." So the picture was complete. They had retrieved their golden child, and now they were here to make sure I didn't make her life any harder. They weren't here to mediate a peace treaty. They were here to manage the fallout so they didn't have to deal with her tantrums anymore. "I have one question," I said, cutting through my mother's rambling about family healing. "Did either of you ever tell her that what she did at my wedding was wrong? Did you ever tell her that tearing up my vows and smashing our cake was an unacceptable thing to do?" My mother looked at her shoes. My father cleared his throat and said, "She was overwhelmed, Carter. She didn't mean to ruin it." "That's not what I asked," I said. "Did you tell her it was wrong?" The silence told me everything. They weren't angry at her for what she did to me. They were just embarrassed by the scene, and the easiest way to make that embarrassment go away was to pressure me into forgiving her so everyone could pretend it never happened. "I'm done," I said, standing up. "I'm done with the money, I'm done with the guilt, and I'm done with the games. If you want to keep funding her life and listening to her podcast about how abusive I am, that is your choice. Lambda, but it won't come from me anymore. You've done a great job raising a daughter who believes consequences don't exist. Now you get to live with her." I walked to the door and opened it wide. They hesitated, looking like they wanted to say more, but the look on my face stopped them. They left quietly. That night, I checked our bank accounts. I looked at our savings, ran the numbers, and looked at Julia. Let's go away, I said. Somewhere far. Somewhere warm. Somewhere where no one knows our last name. Julia smiled, and for the first time in weeks, the tension left her shoulders. Where are we going? The Maldives, I said. 6 weeks. No phones. No family. Just us. The 6 weeks leading up to our trip were a masterclass in psychological warfare, from their side, at least. Cassidy's podcast continued for 2 more episodes. One was titled When They Make You Look Crazy, and the other was about financial abuse inside families. Haley told us that the engagement was dropping fast. People on the internet have a short attention span, and when Cassidy couldn't provide any actual proof of abuse, other than her brother stopping her allowance, the commenters started to turn on her. The sponsors vanished within a month. 2 days before our flight to the Maldives, I was in the bedroom packing my suitcase. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I had unblocked Cassidy's number briefly to make sure there were no more legal loose ends with the car repossession. It was a text message from her. No words. No context. Just a single fire emoji. I showed it to Julia while she was picking up luggage tags. What do you think this means? I asked. Is it a threat? Or is she just saying her life is on fire? Julia didn't even pause. She scanned her boarding pass and tossed it into her carry-on. It doesn't matter what it means, Carter. She's just trying to remind you she's still watching. She wants you to be looking over your shoulder while we're on the beach. She looked at the phone, then looked at me. Perfect, she said. Let it burn. I realized she was right. Cassidy's power only existed as long as I was willing to try and put out the fires she started. If I just let them burn, she had nothing left to throw at me. I blocked the number again, for the last time. We left for the Maldives on a Thursday morning. No layovers, no rush. As the plane leveled out over the ocean, I watched Julia sleep against the window. For the first time in a decade, my brain didn't feel like it was on fire. There were no calculations to make, no rescue missions to plan, no bills to pay for someone who hated me for paying them. When we arrived at our bungalow, which sat literally over the turquoise water, I saw a small wooden sign hanging inside the door. No clocks. Let time be yours again. I sat on the deck and listened to the waves hitting the floorboards underneath me. I didn't think about the $9,400. I didn't think about the torn vows. I just thought about the fact that for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, with the only person who truly had my back. On the 4th day of our trip, we were having breakfast on the deck, surrounded by the sound of tropical birds and the endless blue of the Indian Ocean. Julia took a sip of her juice and looked at me. Do you think they'll ever admit it? She asked softly. I didn't have to ask who she meant. No, I said. But I think they know. I think they feel the silence now that their favorite scapegoat has walked out the door for good. And I truly believed it. My parents knew I was the one who had kept the family afloat. They knew they had let Cassidy's behavior slide because it was easier to pressure me than it was to tell her no. And now, they were left with the version of Cassidy they had created, an adult woman with no job, no car, and a failing podcast, living in their spare bedroom. Haley sent us one last update before we went completely off the grid for the final week. She told us that my parents had officially dipped into their rainy day fund to pay for Cassidy's part-time classes. I almost laughed when I read that. They had the money all along. They had an emergency fund that could have covered her tuition twice over, but they had spent years guilt-tripping me into paying it so they wouldn't have to touch their own savings. That was the final piece of the puzzle. I wasn't just a brother. I was a financial convenience. When Julia and I finally came home, we didn't go back to the old version of our life. We moved into a new place, further from the city and much closer to the quiet. I changed every single password on my bank accounts. I got a new credit card and left my cosigner days in the trash where they belonged. We don't talk about the wedding anymore. It's just a weird, distant blip in a story that no longer belongs to us. Sometimes, on warm nights, we sit on our new porch and watch the neighbor's dog chase moths under the light. We talk about real things, books, future trips, the business Julia is planning to launch. The old life doesn't even feel like mine anymore. It feels like a book I finished reading a long time ago and left on a shelf in a house I no longer live in. I learned something through all of this. Sometimes, fire doesn't need to be fought. Sometimes, you don't need to be the hero with the extinguisher. Sometimes, you just have to let it burn itself out and walk away, finally warm. My family still thinks I overreacted by cutting Cassidy off financially and freezing her out over one bad night. But after a decade of paying for her mistakes and being the family's punching bag, I finally chose my wife, my future, and my peace. So, tell me, am I wrong for letting my family deal with the monster they created? And if my parents ever drain that rainy day fund and come knocking on my door asking for help, should I even bother answering? Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. See you in the next video.